Hello, I'm Bonnie Lee Wolf, President of the National Asian Pacific American Bar Association and Associate Vice President at Nationwide. NAPABA is so pleased to continue our partnership with Justice Goodwin Liu and the American Bar Foundation to further the study of the Asian Americans in the law. The 2017 groundbreaking study, A Portrait of Asian Americans in the Law, identified that Asian Americans have penetrated every sector of the legal profession, but they are significantly underrepresented in the leadership ranks of law firms, governments, and academia. So with this data, NAPABA's focus intensified on mid-career attorneys. And I'm so proud to announce that our Leadership Advancement Program, a year-long program targeted at building leadership skills and providing opportunities to foster genuine relationship with peers, is thriving. We continue to foster the growth and development of an annual cohort of 24 attorneys, which are a mix of law firm, in-house, and government attorneys. And we're excited to launch a public interest component in the very near future. Similarly, NAPABA is well equipped to utilize the data from the most recent study, Who's Going to Law School, and mobilize resources to mitigate the trends. As a member organization, the key findings that this esteemed panel will share with you are significant, and we will most certainly inform how we will look at diversity in the future and in the legal profession. I and the NAPABA board are personally invested in this research and on shining a light on Asian Americans in the law. It is now my pleasure to introduce Ethel, who will serve as the moderator for today's discussion.
Thank you, Bonnie. Welcome to everyone, and thank you for joining us today for what I'm sure will be a dynamic conversation about Asian Americans in the legal profession. I'm Ethel Badawi, co-founder and principal of Pollack Badawi Group in Washington, D.C., and secretary of APABA-DC. Before we jump into the substance, I have just a few housekeeping matters. Note that all attendees are muted during this program. If you would like to ask questions, there's a space in each of your control panels to type the questions. Please feel free to ask the questions as they arise, and we'll address them during the Q&A portion of the program as time allows. I'd also like to thank APABA-DC and NAPABA for hosting our panel today. APABA-DC is the oldest and largest association of APA attorneys in the Washington, D.C. area. NAPABA is a preeminent professional development organization for APA legal professionals nationwide. Both are fantastic organizations that advocate for APAs in the legal profession and the broader community. And I encourage you to consider membership in either or both of the organizations. Finally, I'd like to thank Peter Hyun, partner at Wiley in Washington, D.C., and president-elect of APABA-DC, whose efforts made this panel possible. We'll start our program today with a short overview of the Who's Going to Law School study, and then we'll move into a discussion with our panelists. With that, I'm honored to introduce each of our panelists today, all of whom were authors on the study. If each of you could wave briefly to our audience as I introduce you, that will help our audience get to know you. So we'll start with Miranda. Miranda Li is a 2019 Yale Law graduate. She served on the editorial board of the Yale Law Journal and as student director of the Supreme Court Advocacy Clinic. Next, Philip Yao is also a 2019 Yale Law graduate, where he served as editor-in-chief of the Yale Journal of Law and Technology, and Phil is currently a litigation associate at Ropes & Gray in Boston. And finally, Justice Goodwin Liu, Associate Justice of the California Supreme Court. Before joining California's highest court in 2011, Justice Liu was Professor of Law and Associate Dean at UC Berkeley School of Law. Earlier in his career, Justice Liu served as law clerk to Judge David Tatel on the United States Court of Appeals for the DC Circuit, and then as law clerk for Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Justice Liu is also a Yale Law graduate, though he earned that accomplishment before 2019. Thank you, Miranda, Phil, and Justice Liu for your participation today. Justice Liu, I'll turn it over to you for the overview of the study.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Ethel, and it's a pleasure to be on this webinar. I wish we could all be in person with one another, but until we can do that again, this is the next best thing. I want to express my gratitude to Bonnie and to Peter to NAPABA and to APABA-DC for this opportunity, and really to NAPABA for the continuing partnership now with the American Bar Foundation in the important work that we've been continuing to do on charting the path of Asian Americans in the legal profession. This whole project actually began many years ago now, 5-6 years ago, in collaboration with Yale Law School. That's why so many students from Yale have been represented on these projects, to really provide a systematic account of how Asian Americans are doing in the legal profession, which really hasn't been done. And our initial report in 2017, which I'll show you a few slides from, has given way to an even broader research agenda, of which this current project that we're going to show you the findings of is just one part. So without further ado, let me share my screen with you, which will give you a set of slides, and you can follow along here on this PowerPoint, but also if you want to see the full set of data, you can go to the SSRN site where the paper is posted. It's going to be published in the UC Davis Law Review at the end of this calendar year. We also, I think, sent around a shorter version in the form of American Bar Foundation policy brief, which will give you all the major highlights. So let me just go quickly through the past. I think most of you have seen the Portrait of Asian Americans in the Law report we issued in 2017. That's still available online with a deck of slides if you're interested. The big story of that report was the meteoric rise of Asian Americans in the legal profession over the past generation. If you extend this curve back to 1990, you would see a 5-fold increase in the number of Asian American lawyers from 1990 to 2015. That's the fastest growth of any major racial ethnic group in the profession. We charted that growth by looking at how Asian Americans have been going to law school. I think there are really sort of 3 phases of this. You can see a sort of modest increase from the early 70s to the mid 80s, but then from the mid 80s to the mid 2000s, the numbers just really exploded. I went to law school in 1995, right in the middle of this incredible increase. And this middle picture here is really what accounts for the very sizable numbers of Asian Americans that we see in the legal profession today. And then we noticed this drop-off that has happened since the Great Recession in the late 2000s into 2010. And this became a kind of a motivation for further inquiry into what is going on beneath the numbers. And the current study that we're going to show you the data from today are really focused on this latter part where Asian Americans have been the fastest declining group of any group in the legal profession. As Bonnie said, one of the main findings of our report, in addition to the increase, was that Asian Americans, though penetrating every legal sector, have not reached the highest rungs. And this is evident from the very first kind of, one of the first prestige markers after graduating from law school, which is clerking. So here you see gaps in all the significant minority groups, in terms of numbers at least, significant groups at the top schools. So we looked at the percentage of these groups in the top 30 law graduates and how they fare among federal law clerks and state law clerks, and you see these big gaps. White students who register roughly 60% of the enrollment at these top 30 schools obtained 80% of the federal clerkships. And these numbers, can be replicated for law firm partnerships and for government attorneys at the highest levels. And so we still have a lot of work to do to promote members of our community up to the highest rungs. We're not going to be talking so much about that today, but instead we're going to be talking about the more basic picture of where the enrollment trends are headed and what that means for the growth or a lack of growth as we might have it in our community in the years ahead. So let me turn it over now to Phil to introduce the current study.
Thank you, Justice Liu. For this current iteration of the Portrait Project, we relied on ABA data of JD enrollment from 1998 to 2019. So the ABA makes its raw data publicly available online back to 2011. So we essentially had to reach out to them to get the raw data going back to 1998. The data is broken down by law school and in turn by race, gender, and other parameters. The data is self-reported and collected by the law schools, which then send the data on to the ABA. So one of the categories is non-resident aliens. So what some people might consider international students. They're a separate category in the ABA data, so they're generally not counted in any racial group. The same is true of students who are multiracial. These students are placed in the bucket of 2 or more races. So if you're both white and Asian, you don't show up in either bucket, but you only appear in the numbers for 2 or more races. The exception, and that's the bullet above, is Hispanic students who are subject to maximum reporting. So unlike other racial groups, Hispanic students are actually fully counted. So even if they fall under the non-resident alien category or the 2 or more races category, they will be counted in the Hispanic category. The definitions have changed around throughout the years, but since 2011, they've basically been fairly consistent and tied to the National Center of Education Statistics definitions. Next slide, please. So we also reached out to LSAC, the Law School Admissions Council, to get their raw data, which is not publicly available, but they've released some reports based off their data. We received aggregated data on the number of applicants, admittees, and matriculants to law school. So those are the 3 general stages in admission. And the data divides into race ethnicity categories. Like with Hispanic reporting at the ABA, LSAC actually does maximum reporting of all race ethnicity categories. So as you can imagine, this can lead to an overcount of students when you add up all the different groups. LSAC also disaggregates foreign educated versus domestic educated students, and that's defined as where those students went to their undergraduate institutions. So all this is setting up the data that we're about to present in the following slides. Next slide, please. So based off the ABA data, this is what you see here is a total curve of the curve of total JD enrollment for roughly the past 20 years. We see this steady growth in JD enrollment until about 2010, 2011, whereas Justice Liu mentioned the recession, impact from the recession was felt, and you start to see this decline in enrollment. The peak is in 2011, and then the subsequent decline goes all the way until around 2017. But around that year, we actually start to see a slow rebound. Some have colloquially called this rebound the Trump bump, but it's not entirely clear what's driving the rebound here, or if it's simply a case of regression to some mean, potentially. Next slide. So if we break down JD enrollment by gender over the same period, we see that, unsurprisingly, men, who are the orange line in that graph, have for a long time outnumbered women, the green line, in terms of JD enrollment. That is until around 2016, when the 2 curves cross and women begin to outnumber men in JD enrollment for the first time in history. The curves have continued along this trend in the 3 subsequent years after 2016. This recent development has been touted by various news outlets as a success story, but further nuance, which we explore later in this presentation, may not paint quite as rosy a picture. Next slide, please. So we could also break down JD enrollment by race over the same period, and we see that the top graph is white students. They generally follow the overall curve, mostly because they make up over 60% of JD enrollment. You actually can't have them on the same linear graph because it makes the other race ethnicity groups sort of just look like squashed lines. The bottom graph zooms in on Hispanic students, who are the blue line, Black students, the red line there, and Asian students, who are the green line. So if we focus in on that green line for Asian students, there's a fairly significant rise in enrollment pre-recession, as the earlier graph showed. Other groups rise as well, but post-recession, the Asian students fall off very hard in enrollment, and that's continued past the years that we highlighted in the earlier graph, with a sort of flattening in these most recent years. And interestingly, Hispanic students have continued to rise in number over this entire period of overall decline, with Black students in more of a holding pattern. Next slide, please. Focusing on the overall peak year in enrollment, which was 2011, until 2019, which is the latest set of ABA data, and looking at the share of overall students, so this factors in the overall decline. Asian students have dropped in share in that left column you see there, from 7.3% to 6.3%. And that 1% absolute drop actually represents about a 14% relative drop in share. On the other hand, the other group that declined, white students, their share dropped from 66.1% to 61.9%. And that 4% absolute drop represents only about a 6% relative drop in share. So we have a 14% relative drop for Asian students versus a 6% relative drop for white students, while the other groups have risen in share during this period. So what that shows is that Asian students really appear to have been affected the most during this period of decline. Next slide, please. So here we've broken down the data by race and gender, so both together. The darker curves in each graph represent women, while the lighter curves represent men. So, interestingly, different genders for a given race seem to track each other in the curve shape. Though the meteoric rise in Hispanic women, which you can see in the blue graph, is particularly of note. Also important to note is that the gains in the number of women enrolling in law schools seems due in large part to the increase in white women enrolling in law schools. You can see this from the shape of the dark curve on the bottom right, and from the relatively higher numbers of white students in law schools in general. So the dark curve sort of ticks up as we get into more recent years. Another interesting thing to note is that women have consistently outnumbered men for all three of the minority groups graphed here. So the historical enrollment gap in terms of gender can mostly be attributed to the large numbers of white men enrolled in law schools. So that's an overall picture, which we've subsequently broken down further. And I'm going to turn it now over to Miranda, who's going to talk about the data in even further detail. Miranda?
Thanks, Phil. So the data that Phil just walked us through was in the aggregate, but one thing our team wondered was, are there ways to segment the data so that we can get a more granular understanding of what some of these trends were? So to that end, one approach we took was to look at groupings of schools, what we call in our report tiers. So just so you can get to the next slide. Yeah, so basically at the outset, actually, we wanted to be clear that these tiers are meant merely as tools for data analysis. Our intent is certainly not to create an ordering or a hierarchy of schools, particularly given all of the known and very real shortcomings of any system of law school rankings. But to explain our methodology, so we first took a historical 9-year average of each law school's rank according to the US and News World Report, given the ubiquity and salience of that source. And then we constructed 6 different groupings. So for those schools that were ranked, we first divided them into 5 roughly even tiers based on total student enrollment. And then we adjusted for sort of any natural breaks in average rankings. That created 5 groups. And then after that, we assigned unranked schools to a 6th tier. So on the next slide, slide 14, it'll show you sort of where we ended up. There are roughly 18 to 20,000 students per tier, and you see in the middle column the number of schools represented in each. So roughly 30, with tier 1 being a little smaller and tier 5 being a little larger. So if you go to the next slide, this might be a little overwhelming at first, but what did we find when we looked at the data through the lens of tiers? So what you see here is the graph that Phil had walked you through earlier, enrollment broken up by gender, with here men denoted by the orange line and women denoted by the green line. But here we've included a separate graph for each tier, so you can sort of see the tier effects. And what is immediately apparent is that the gender distribution is quite different from tier to tier, and also seems historically to have been so. This is something you can tell from the shape of the graph, especially if you compare, for instance, tier 1 on the top left to tier 6 on the bottom left. Justice Liu likes to call this a fish turning into an alligator, so I will borrow this colloquialism. So while there is a noticeable gender gap in tier 1 through tier 4 for much of the 2000s, there actually wasn't as much daylight in between the percentages of male and female enrollment for that time frame in tier 6. And on the flip side, while the share of women has increased by roughly the same percentage from the lowest to the highest points, the gulf between men and women is widest and most noticeable in the unranked schools as compared with any other tier. So we thought this was a pretty interesting distinction that we wanted to call out, and we wouldn't have seen if we hadn't sort of taken the tier analysis. If you go to the next slide. So, you might wonder, why would these findings of differential effects across tiers matter? As you guys may know, the ABA requires each school to report on certain metrics of performance and outcomes for its students. So when we consider the interaction effects between the changing demographics of enrollment and then some of this data on likelihood of certain student outcomes, it may raise some questions that the aggregate data and aggregate headlines would obscure. So on this slide, we have the bar passage rates for 2016 graduates. And as you can see, the rate at which students pass the bar tends to decline with each tier, and tier 6 especially has a lower rate than the others. Similarly, if you go to the next slide, employment rates also tend to decline with each tier, and tier 6 again has a noticeably lower rate than the others. But if you recall the alligator in tier 6, those schools are also where a great number of female students are enrolling. So for us, this sort of prompts the second order questions of how exactly increased enrollment of certain demographics will translate into lasting effects. After all, for there to be material improvement in the profession as a whole with respect to diversity, students have to get through the pipeline, pass the bar, and actually become practicing lawyers. So these are sort of some questions that we had in looking through the data. If you go to the next slide, the tier framework actually revealed also some similarly interesting observations with respect to race and ethnicity. So one trend that stands out here is that Asian students tend to decrease from tier 1 to tier 6, whereas Black and Hispanic students tend to increase in number from tier 1 to tier 6. And this increase seems especially pronounced if you look at the graph all the way on the right in tier 6. Now, if you go to the next slide will show you the change in demographics in each tier over time, rather than giving you a static snapshot as the previous slide had done. So on this slide, for every tier, the gray bar, the one all the way on the left, represents overall change in enrollment for that tier from 2011 to 2019. Next to that are the bars for each of the other race and ethnicities. So a first observation, you can hit next, yeah. A first observation is that Asian enrollment declined more in every tier than the aggregate change. You can see this because the bar is lower than the gray bar. This is also, if you go to the next arrow, somewhat the pattern for white enrollment, which declined as much or more in each tier except for tier 1. On the other hand, we see a slightly different pattern for Black and Hispanic students. So Black students have declined more than the aggregate in tiers 1 through 3, but declined less in tiers 4 through 6, and even actually increasing in tier 5. And meanwhile, as you can see with the blue bars, Hispanic enrollment has increased in virtually every tier. So if you go to the next slide, slide 20 actually gives some of the numbers associated with that first phenomenon, which is the drastic decrease of Asian students, which is of particular interest to us. It's a pretty large percentage decrease, one that no matter the data set you use, whether ABA or LSAC, is consistently the largest among all demographics. So just to see if you can show the circles, you'll see those percentages are quite large. Great, and if you go to the next slide, so if this trend continues, it will definitely affect the trajectory of future Asian American representation in the profession. So what we try to do, and which this slide depicts, this is a very basic replacement model that we made to get a flavor for projected Asian American lawyers for the next couple of decades. We use some simplistic assumptions that a majority of graduates would pass the bar and become lawyers, and that careers would last roughly 40 years, for example. So this traced how the pool of lawyers would change, given that every year a cohort would retire and a new graduating cohort would replace them. So basically what's shown here are two different scenarios. The green line indicates calculations with the added assumption that Asian American law school enrollment and therefore graduating classes of lawyers would increase commensurate with general census-based population growth, which is approximately 1%, whereas the blue line indicates an assumption that enrollment would be kept constant at recent levels, in particular in 2018. So under that latter scenario, we would expect to see a decrease in Asian American lawyers a little over 20 years into the future. Sorry. Sorry. So under that latter scenario, we'd expect to see a decrease in Asian American lawyers a little over 20 years into the future, which conveys to us the importance of sort of paying careful attention to the pipeline. So finally, if you go to the next slide, a lot of our focus during this project, this part of the project, was purely descriptive. We were trying to make data available for sort of a broader baseline understanding. But naturally, the data raised many questions about causes. You know, why were there declines? Why for certain groups? Why during certain times? And so on. As a result, this slide presents, I think, one of the more interesting trends we discovered. AALS and Gallup collaborated on a series of attitudinal surveys they administered to both college and law school students, asking numerous questions about their decision-making process and what they sort of valued when they were considering graduate school. And one of the more notable findings from that study was about the timing of when students said they first considered going to law school. And what you'll see in that red circle is that Asian American law students were, on the whole, less likely to have decided on law school earlier in their lives, meaning high school or before, and were far and away much more likely than the other demographics to have first considered going to law school after college. So they didn't even consider law school until after they had graduated college. So this was intriguing to our team. We thought it was consistent with anecdotal stories of many Asian Americans sort of not knowing any lawyers personally or having any lawyers in the family, for instance. But of course, there remain additional questions on sort of what causes that. And the other thing I'll note is that one of AALS's general recommendations from that study was that law schools and career offices should dedicate more resources to sort of outreach to generate interest in the profession among earlier children. And that's definitely something that might be considered with respect to Asian Americans, particularly given this finding. Great, so now I'll turn it back to Justice Liu to discuss some of the additional demographic trends that we found interesting.
Great, thank you. Let me round out the presentation with two more sets of findings that are of particular interest to Asian American community. So the first concerns these non-resident alien. I only use that term because that's a term that the ABA uses, the official term. You can think of these as international students. And here you see that over the last decade, these students have increased quite remarkably in number and in percentage over a small period of time. This is pronounced at the top tier schools. You see that the top line there, the blue one, is the tier 1 schools, where these international students comprise as much as 6, 7, almost 8% of the student body, and whereas in all the other tiers, it's somewhere between 1 and 4%. So that's an interesting segmentation of how international students distribute themselves, and we can talk about some of the reasons for that. But here's something of particular interest, which is that by and large, this, or quite largely, I should say, this international student phenomenon is an Asian phenomenon. So Asian students make up somewhere on the order of 30 to 40% of these international students in law school over this period. So this highlights the importance in the data collection mechanisms we have of distinguishing between Asian and Asian American students, and this is true throughout the profession as well. Those of you who work in the law firms know that sometimes it's quite ambiguous when firms report, their Asian partnership numbers. What are they talking about? Are they talking about Asians, meaning Asians writ large, including in international offices throughout the world, or are they talking about Asian Americans, which is a different category? And these different sets of students may have different career trajectories and have different social salience, let's say, in the conversations about diversity, and we can have some Q&A about that. The other piece I want to talk about is 2 or more races, multiracial students. So as Phil said at the outset, the ABA counts these multiracial students in an entirely separate category. So when you see Asian numbers from the ABA, they don't include anybody who's mixed race. And these mixed race students have increased significantly. You see over the past decade from around 1.5% or so to pushing over 3.5% today. And in terms of absolute numbers, you see the rise. This, of course, is only going to continue, as we know from our increasingly multiracial society. If you look at all the projections, we looked at some from the Pew Research Foundation. And again, this is an important piece for Asians in particular, because if you look at intermarriage rates and if you look at birth rates, a lot of the multiracial story is a story about mixed race students who are Asian. And again, for purposes of counting and for purposes of charting people's experiences, it's important to have this group of students and individuals included within that story. So I'll stop there. That's really the end of the data that we have. And I'll invite your comments and questions and turn it back over to Ethel.
Wonderful, thank you. There's a lot of data here that's very interesting that I'm sure will be fodder for some great discussion. Before we jump into the data, Justice Liu, I just wonder if you could give us some context for, how the 2017 report left you feeling about Asian Americans in the profession, and how does that contrast with this more recent study and your, projections for APA attorneys and the careers of APA attorneys going forward?
Right. So I think, the 2017 study was really interesting just from the standpoint of, learning about our community. And so many of you in the audience are familiar with it, both because we presented it all over the country, and it actually, to my surprise, got a lot of attention, including in the mainstream media and other sources. And I think it speaks to a few things. One is the tremendous interest in the profession and in society at large in these issues of diversity. Lawyers occupy a very privileged place in society, and people are super interested in knowing who are these people and where do they come from and what experiences do they bring with them and represent. So that's one. The second is that I think there was just a tremendous kind of good news story, if you want to put it that way, of just how much progress has been made. I speak to folks like, Dale Manami or my colleague Ming Chin on the California Supreme Court. They always joke that they went to law school at a time, when the number of Asian American lawyers, could have fit in a single classroom in all of America, could have fit in a single classroom. And we take it for granted today that when we, go to an APABA convention, when we can go to such conventions again, there are 2,000, 2,500 people there. That is, just an amazing accomplishment for our community over a fairly short period of time. But then the third piece, I think, was the sort of things that we need to dig deeper in. And we uncovered a lot of the obstacles, I think, that Asian Americans perceive to advancement in their careers. And what I heard over and over again from members of our community was that our report did not really, it isn't so much that we offered anything earth-shatteringly new, it's that we put in one place and backed it up with numbers and data, the experiences that people knew in their bones that they have had, and thus validating those experiences, concretizing them, and giving them a piece of evidence, a piece of research that they could then bring to decision makers, to their firm hiring committees, to their law schools, to talk about an issue I think that is often invisible, as our community often is. And so I think making it visible, making it concrete, validating people's experiences, I think that was a lot of the value. And then now, with our new report, I think we need to pay closer attention to not just the successes, but what is worrisome in the trend lines. And I think where we ended in terms of the projected number of Asian American lawyers, it's very worrisome in the sense that if we have taken for granted what we've seen in the last 10, 15, 20 years in terms of the growth of our community in the profession, we shouldn't take it for granted, because it's going to come to an end. That's what all the projected trend lines show, unless we change something in terms of our outreach or in terms of what messages we're sending to members of our community who are coming up behind us.
Absolutely, and I definitely do want to address some potential solutions to this a little later in the conversation. To Miranda and to Phil, you both noted that when students consider law school as a potential career decision can really impact the pipeline. And I'm I'd be curious to know when the two of you, being more recent law graduates, started considering law school, and also, why do you think that timing makes a difference? Miranda, we can start with you.
Oh, sure. Well, so I actually, I told this joke when I was sort of recruiting for law firms, but I've wanted to be a lawyer. I've known I wanted to be a lawyer since I was 7, and that was all thanks to a TV show I watched called The Practice. Little did I know that the work that I actually do as a lawyer is very far from what I saw in The Practice. But so for me, I'm sort of one of I'm not that number on that graph or on that table because, I sort of knew earlier on. But I think that was really helpful for me because, sort of having that interest, it led me to make some very particular decisions in sort of my schooling years. I did a lot of activities that would be more associated with law and let me explore a lot of the concepts behind law. I think particularly important was, when I was in college, I sort of took some of the legal classes, like constitutional law, but also I double majored, and one of them was this major called Law, Letters, and Society. And the intro course very much felt like a law school course. I know Hamer v. Sidway very well because it was first drilled into me as a college student, but also I sort of knew that I had to pay attention to grades. I sort of understood I would need record measures, and I can't imagine if I hadn't decided to, if I hadn't known I wanted to go to law school, if I would have been able to sort of scramble to get that together after the fact. So obviously it can be done, but I just think that it made the process a little easier for me. And, especially if we're thinking about increasing the pipeline, sort of facilitating and reducing some of those transaction costs are helpful.
Yeah, from my perspective, unlike Miranda, I only really considered law school near the end of college and afterward. I think part of that was because no one in my family was in the law. We were first generation immigrants. We didn't really have any family friends who were in the law. I guess though, technically I'm first generation, but I think most people would call me part of the 1.5 generation since I was mostly raised in the US. But anyway, growing up, I just wasn't exposed to law very much, even during high school. Now, during college, I majored in physics, minored in philosophy, and I found that I really enjoyed philosophy. And a lot of what I studied touched upon political philosophy and also legal philosophy, and I also became really interested in education. At the same time, during college, I met other college students who were interested in the law. So people never really talked about interest in the law in high school, in my personal experience. But in college, there are people who are clearly aiming for legal careers, clearly aiming for law school. So for me, I feel like there was just a lag in terms of exposure and even having that idea planted in my mind. And unlike Miranda, my parents didn't really let me watch TV growing up, so I didn't have too much exposure to lawyers on TV. And I feel like the only thing I really remember seeing as a kid was shows like Judge Judy or Judge Mathis, which it might not be the best representation of what the law is. That's my experience.
Thank you. One thing that in reading the study that you didn't quite touch upon in your slides, but one thing that struck me was that Asian Americans often factored earning and advancement potential as one of the reasons that might prevent them from enrolling in law school. And I wonder, how you think that impacts or how the cost of legal education might also impact enrollment in law school, and how does that affect the trend? Do you think it affects Asians disproportionately, or do you think that that's part of the greater trend of law school enrollment?
Well, I think that's that certainly is a factor. I think that our report identified really a couple things that as hypotheses that could be driving the trend lines. One was what Miranda focused on, which was sort of information deficits, maybe generational, lack of generational advantages, let's put it that way, that might drive people to law in earlier point in their careers and do so with more familiarity with what getting into law involves. The other, I think, is some data that the American Bar Foundation has found through their after the JD study, which is a longitudinal study of some 5,000 graduate people who became lawyers actually in the year 2000. And there is some evidence for differential sensitivity of Asian Americans to financial considerations as a motivation for going to law school, and then even in terms of career path that they choose going out. So for example, Asian Americans are most likely to be found in firms and in private sector work after law school. They also graduate law school with the lowest educational debt of all the major groups, and at least in the initial years after law school, have the highest earnings. And so you can sort of tell a story about the sensitivity of our community to financial considerations, which may be driven by a lot of things. I don't want to, paint a picture of us as sort of, greedy, people who are only obsessed about, earning money in the profession. I think it's driven in part by immigrant histories, a sense of insecurity about the place of their place in a new society, a society that's unfamiliar, and longing for a degree of security and having that cushion, against all kinds of things that are unfamiliar. But I think I'll be interested to see how that changes. Think about the bulge that of all those students who went to law school from 1985 to about 2005, and they are coming into the prime of their careers, and they're having kids, and their kids are now growing up, and their kids are growing up in a social setting now with a resource that they themselves, I consider myself part of this group, did not have. Namely, they have 55,000 Asian American lawyers as part of the legal profession in America, and that did not used to exist. And so I think it just underscores doubly so how much it is incumbent upon all of us who are already in the profession to reach back out into our communities and change the picture for them in terms of the horizons that they think are available and the aspirations that they can have, because that's actually something that is relatively new, and it's not something that people had a generation ago.
I can also add something. So in that same study that we referenced with respect to the timing of when Asian students made the decision to go to school, one of the other interesting nuances from that pair of studies from ALS was that although on the one hand Asians as a group cite the potential to sort of earn money as an important characteristic when selecting a career, on the other hand, the study also had this question that asked about what are potential factors that might deter you from pursuing the graduate degree that you're interested in. And of course, in the aggregate, cost and potential debt was a big factor. It was across the board for every single graduate program, one of the main factors. But the interesting nuance is that comparatively, that was cited as a concern, or one of the top concerns, a little bit less by Asian students than other demographics. So it was 58% for Asian respondents, whereas the next lowest was 68% for white students. So obviously, we don't want to risk extrapolating too much from the results of one attitudinal study, but we thought this was an interesting nuance about maybe sort of balancing the short-term costs of legal education versus the longer-term dividends that one would expect from a legal career in later years. And that would seem pretty consistent with sort of the general emphasis on education and willingness to spend with that education. But of course, that's a little bit of speculation.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you. As we talk about sort of the advancement of Asian Americans in the profession and also the motivations for going to law school, I wonder how you think the current pandemic is going to affect enrollment in law schools. There is some conventional wisdom that more people enroll in schools in times where it's difficult to find a job right after college. And I wonder, what you perceive as the potential impact of what we're seeing in today's economy and with the pandemic. Any of you?
Yeah, I'll take a first crack. I mean,
sure.
I think what you said there is the conventional economic wisdom. So if you look at economists' projections, typically it's true. People seek shelter in education when the job market doesn't look good. And so that was partly true, I think, in the Great Recession of 2008 and 9. It took a few years, actually, before you started to see the actual year-by-year decline at least with respect to law schools. And something dropped out of the law school, market that was very, very significant, but it took a few years to kind of get there. I think it's possible that that will happen as well. I think it's also possible that the changing complexion of education and the uncertainty created by the pandemic may cause some students to defer their admission or to sit out schooling until they kind of know what they're going to get. I've heard just anecdotally lots of stories of people being wary of paying big sticker price tuition and getting a kind of pale version of what they really expect from going to law school. So it's really uncertain, I think, how it's going to turn out. I mean, one thing that I hope that our community in particular takes away from the current situation is how important it is that Asian Americans be engaged in law and in the public sphere. I mean, it shouldn't be lost on anyone in our community that the pandemic has raised a whole number of, I think, very troubling social issues, including anti-Asian bias of all sorts. I think NAPABA has been very active in this area. I saw that recently it was announced there's a hate crimes resources website that NAPABA has put up, which is terrific. This is a call to action, I think, for our community. And I would hope that instead of sort of sidelining themselves and waiting and seeing what's going to happen, that members of our community who are coming up, and I think, actually the young people, I put a lot of faith in them, have demonstrated a great awareness of these issues in society, and hopefully then a motivation to seek out fields of study like the law that are directly involved in it.
That leads actually very well into my next question, which is, whether we think that the unfortunate increase in discrimination against Asians and the rise in xenophobia against Asians in this time of COVID will have an impact on Asian Americans who pursue public interest careers, or even just sort of driving some additional enrollment in law school to pursue some sort of social justice issues. Any thoughts on that? Phil, we can start with you. If you've seen either any peers or colleagues, even just sort of in your law school class, go in that direction.
Sure, yeah. Well, some of the studies we looked at, including the AALS study, seem to say that a lot of students, Asian students entering law schools, their motivation, political motivations, like social justice motivations, did rank a bit lower than other motivations. That's sort of what we saw, but it's unclear when it's this targeted, toward the Asian community, this level of discrimination and people's frustration, people blaming the Asian community for the spread of COVID, in the U.S., which is, to me, is really illogical. That maybe that could spur something different this time, but yeah, it seems like in the past it's been sort of a lower level of political engagement, I guess, as a motivating factor for joining law schools. If anyone else has any additional thoughts, definitely feel free to chime in.
Yeah, I guess I would say, that study that Phil was referring to, in general, Asian students don't seem to view law as a tool for social change to quite the same degree as, students from other groups. But I would say, anecdotally, at least my experience with the Black Lives Matter movement recently has been a little bit instructive. Historically, we've been a little more passive, or at least that's sort of the observation among a lot of my peers. But in this recent turn of events, people have been a lot more sort of proactive and speaking about it. And so I would assume sort of the trajectory is improving. But honestly, yeah, it's sort of hard to say. I am hopeful, though.
How do you think we can balance the tensions of sort of paying focus to the Black Lives Matter movement and that sort of racial injustice, but also, sort of focus on the concerns of APA attorneys and APA discrimination against Asian Americans that's happening? I mean, do you think there is an effective way to sort of have that conversation in the Black Lives Matter movement?
You know, I think that there are many things that are distinctive about the experiences of African Americans in this country. And I think, if anything, the events of the last several months have all heightened our awareness of that distinctiveness and the importance of understanding it and, in some ways, figuring out how law and public policy can respond to it. At the same time, I think that there's also a broader awareness that racism exists in all kinds of forms in our society, and these are all interconnected things. I mean, the history of the country is not a set of isolated group experiences, but they are woven together through a variety of historical forces and policies. And I mean, here I sit on a court. Even the courts are also involved in all of this. That are, in a sense, interrelated. And so most of the justice advocates that I know are deeply engaged, not just with respect to one group or one set of grievances, but with respect to the entire range of ways in which our society has not made all its members feel as included as they really should be. I think that, for Asian Americans in particular, this is an area, I think, again, where members of the profession, all of us who are on this webinar, have a role to play. The attitudinal aspects that Phil described are definitely true. When you look at, surveys that have figured out, what are your motivations for going to law schools, Asian Americans register very low in terms of social justice motivations, political motivations. Why is that? Well, I don't know. I mean, you can think about your own family experiences and kind of extrapolate from there. But again, here's where we have an opportunity. Those of us who are in the profession have a role to play in communicating to our community what the concerns of the broader society and our very own community are and should be. And people who are coming up take cues from what they see in their leaders and the people who are ahead of them in a way. This has led to some interesting, discussions about just family dynamics. And, I saw a few stories in the paper about, kids having to explain to their parents what it means to go to a protest and, parents not too keen on that. And, but these actually are the most important conversations. In the same set of data, actually, that we looked at, it should be said also that Asian Americans respond very highly compared to other groups in terms of when they think about the forces that impinge on their career decisions, pleasing their families, right? Cohering with family expectations is a very high vector for Asian Americans. And so this is really intimate stuff. And I think, all of us who have kind of made the leap, have done different things, have broken out of the mold in whatever way. I mean, I can only imagine how many people on this call were the first in their families to become a lawyer. That different experience that you've had needs to be taken and communicated back out to, members of your community who are undergoing the same, family dynamic, because for every person who was the first in their family to go to college, there were probably 5 or 6 others who did not make that decision. And those are people who could have been assets to the profession, could have been assets to our community in the profession. And that's the way, we need to build change. So I think this is a really golden moment of opportunity because we have an external set of events that provides, I think, an easy way, actually not easy as an easy conversation, but easy as in convenient way for us to initiate this conversation that really needs to be had.
And just to follow up to that, do you think that conversation really, needs to focus on the students, the sort of pipeline of future attorneys, or how can we also incorporate the broader community, the families that are supporting the potential new lawyers that are going to be joining the profession? To your point, I think I had this weird dichotomy in my personal experience where I was the first one to go to law school, and yet, the only 2 options my mother really presented to me were like medical school or law school, neither of which we had any in my family. But I think, to your point, if we really do need to educate the upcoming pipeline, I think there's an important family component there too. And how do we reach that broader community to sort of help the next generation of APA attorneys?
I don't have a great answer for that, but I know that I've been talking to Priya and others at NAPABA about this very issue, and it's going to happen at a different level. We have to step outside our usual networks and bubbles to talk to, college placement counselors. We have to talk to high school counselors. We have to talk to people who are in touch with these families and their students at a very retail level. The other piece of it, actually, for those of you who work in various industries, frankly, is media. What we see as representations on television, in movies. I've often talked about this. Those of you who have ever heard me talk about the subject, that in most mainstream depictions of law or the legal system, you hardly ever see Asian Americans represented as lawyers. I always point to the Law and Order television show that, in 20 some years of syndication, to my knowledge, never cast an Asian American ever as a lawyer. And that was in New York City. How could that be? It's not that there are no lawyers who are prosecutors, defense counsel, or even judges in New York City. Of course there are, but it speaks to the invisibility of Asian Americans in this particular sector. And if you think about it from a media standpoint, what is perceived to be the lack of credibility of members of our community in that role. And I think that has to change. There needs to be greater demands, I think, placed for representations of Asian American in the mass, in mass media that shows our three-dimensionality in this sector, because until that changes, we'll never reach, I think, a really truly broad audience and change people's expectations of what you can become.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. Seeing some additional role models would certainly increase the interest and just the feasibility, sort of being able to see yourself in that role. I wonder, based on your research, that women have really been able to close the gap on enrollment, if there are lessons to be learned there, or lessons to be learned even from the drastic increase of Asian American enrollment in the 90s and early 2000s that we can implement now to sort of help reverse the downward trend. I think Miranda, was it Phil or Miranda that did the fish to alligator?
I mean, I have a few thoughts I could share here.
Sure.
That one thing that's emerged on like many different levels is the importance of mentorship. I guess, if people on this call, female lawyers on this call, are able to somehow develop mentorship, relationships with, college age or like high school level women who are interested in law, we've seen that mentorship is really important within law firms as well. So whether someone makes partner or leaves, whether that person adds the attrition numbers, it's very dependent on how many mentors they have at the firm. And the same is true within law schools for things like clerkships and other outcomes that they might be seeking. So just in thinking about what kind of mentorship opportunities there are to provide to the younger generation, I think is very, very important in terms of increasing numbers. I mean, it's a very piecemeal, small way to do it, but I think collectively, if a lot of people have that mindset, you could affect like a bigger change.
Yeah, I think it's kind of hard to isolate sort of independent causal reasons for why we've been able to close the gender gap. I think there are sort of a number of things that have been effective. Mentorship, directed outreach. I know a lot of law schools have worked really hard to sort of try and reach out proactively to students who fit sort of demographics or who are typically underrepresented and encourage them. And I think also this touches upon the conversation we were just having about having role models. I think that when you start to build towards a critical mass, and you see sort of more representation, figures like RBG, or there are sort of more salient women figures than certainly Asian figures. And so you're sort of seeing that snowball, but it really is sort of hard to look at the numbers and be able to pinpoint why. But definitely there's sort of a lot of factors working in concert. So,
I mean, did you find anything in your studies about, why we were able to sort of achieve that increase a couple decades ago, and are there lessons that we can learn from there? I mean, certainly at that point in the 90s and early 2000s, the lack of Asian role models and mentors, I think, was probably the same as now, if not even a little bit worse. And yet we were able to see that increase in enrollment. And so what lessons might we learn from that we can implement now to reverse the current trend that we're seeing? Any insights?
What you just asked there points to a gap in our knowledge, and it's something that we probably at some point need to go back and explore, which is what really did account for the explosive rise of Asian Americans during that sort of 20-year period. Certainly the economy in certain cycles was good during that period. The tech boom happened during that period, and I think those were significant draws. Query whether those are huge enough factors to explain such a dramatic increase. One has to look at other kind of underlying trends, just basic trends like undergraduate enrollment. What was happening to Asian Americans in college during that period? All of that, I think, needs to be explored. I think if you put our figures today in some of that perspective, it's even more troubling because Asian Americans continue to attain college degrees at a very high rate, and that is increasing, but the law figure continues to go down. So there's no lack of Asian Americans who are emerging, with 4-year degrees, but they're just not pursuing law for whatever reason. I have another hypothesis about our community, and it may explain both the rise and the decrease, which is just smallness. That those people who study network effects you might posit that in small communities, certain kind of narratives or perceptions become sticky more easily. It's harder to disrupt a perception when there's not a broad diversity. If you look at, communities, just take white students as a bigger example. White students may drop off in law a little bit, but there's never going to be a shortage of white lawyers in America. I mean, there's just a lot of them, and so no matter even though there is a decline, I don't think there is kind of like a word on the street that law has become uniformly bad, for a broad population of people. Well, I think that's a little different when you're talking about the small communities that just speaking from personal experience, that people my generation, or more importantly, people of my parents' generation, inhabited. They're small immigrant communities, the communities in which they get information, the communities whom they trust. These can be, I think, difficult to penetrate. And so when a certain narrative takes hold, either law is good, law is bad, or whatever it is, it takes more effort in some ways to dislodge those things. I mean, that's just another hypothesis to add to the mix. But I think you're right. We need to understand better, and indeed, maybe the people who are on the webinar today, who are, who have as much gray hair as I do, can speak to what motivated them, to go to law school at the time they did, because understanding that might give us a clue about the future.
Great, thank you. And I'll just take that opportunity to say that I am happy to take questions from the audience as well, so please do type them into the chat. I have a follow-on question to that though, and I wonder if part of that impact, and this is just me sort of thinking about this through our conversation, it could be the decrease in APA or Asian American law students be affected by that increase in international Asian students. Do you think there is a risk here that law schools are conflating their Asian enrollment populations? And what can we do about that? And in the community, how can we sort of advocate for Asian Americans and international students, but as different cohorts? Or is it important that they are different cohorts?
You know, whether they're conflating is an interesting question. I think the answer is yes and no. No, in the sense that law schools report mostly ABA data. And as Phil said at the outset, ABA data separately report the international students. So if you're an Asian foreign national, you're typically reported outside of the Asian category. That's the no part of the answer. The yes part of the answer is that if you think about student life at law schools, when the law schools send you their glossy brochures with the pictures of all their diverse students, I'm pretty sure that most times there isn't a firm distinction drawn between who's a foreign national and who's not. And I think that conflates, the picture a little bit, because we have to understand a little bit about nationality if we want to fully come to grips with experiences. So we allude to this in the paper. We don't develop it in any great depth, but it's entirely possible that foreign national students end up staying here in the United States and have a great affinity. Some even maybe become naturalized and become citizens. And so some of them may assimilate themselves to the Asian American experience. But then others of them may take their JDs and pass American, get American license of some sort, but they actually go back to their home countries, or they practice in an American firm, but their practice is primarily outward facing towards international practice. Nothing wrong with that, of course, nothing wrong with that at all. But it's just that in order to better understand these different experiences, we need to approach them with a different level of granularity. So what can be done? I think the most important thing is to insist that law schools, as well as law firms, this goes to all institutions, report their numbers in nuanced ways that draw these distinctions, and to promote conversations that highlight the ways in which these different groups have different experiences, and not simply lump them all together. I think, probably at an earlier point in time, there was some advantage in kind of just lumping everyone together because the numbers were so small. And so just to get recognized was enough, and so just, having those numbers. But today, it is a significantly conflating approach because we're talking about very large numbers. I mean, at some of the law schools, the percentage of Asian students who are foreign national students is like 10%. That is not a small number. So if you are counting, 100% experience made up of 90 plus 10 who are, kind of different, that's not, accurate. And so we need to insist on that greater granularity.
The other nuance that would be interesting, I think, is just as we're sort of in the middle of a pandemic and trying to understand how current events will affect some of the findings we've had with respect to the numbers, also just the current immigration and political climate, that's also currently developing. And obviously it's too early to tell because there is a little bit of a lag, but it is something to keep in mind, especially if it becomes more difficult for students to be able to apply or to stay after they graduate. So something to consider.
We have a question here from the audience, and it is, in effect, do you think that the increase in mixed race students has an impact, or even a more significant impact on Asian American students in law schools, in that more of those mixed race students may perhaps be Asian or partially Asian?
I could comment on this. I believe the ABF, the American Bar Foundation, had looked into this, and I know from the director that he found that intermarriage rates were relatively high among Asian and white individuals. So we could probably extrapolate that like a good chunk of the people in the ABA data, 2 or more races, are Asian. Also considering the fact that because Hispanics are subject to maximum counting, they're actually drawn out of that group. So, I mean, you could hypothesize that, of the, 2 remaining significant groups, there might be white Asian, white Black, and also Asian Black to some extent as well in those groups. So they're probably a pretty big chunk of the statistics there.
Good, thank you. Another question we have is, what role does the cultural tradition and emphasis on medical and STEM careers play in APA career choices? And what can we do to present the law as a more viable career choice for APA, the APA community?
Well, if I had a nickel for every lawyer who told me that they first started out going to medical school, veered off into law, that was certainly my experience as well. I was, I had applied and gotten into medical school, and I was deferred before to go to medical school before I even considered going to law school. So I walked all the way down the plank and was ready to jump. So this is. And then STEM fields. I mean, STEM fields. We've seen. I should have said actually at the outset that part of what we've observed in the general decline of students going to law school is part of a broader societal trend of magnetism towards STEM. That has been much remarked on in higher education generally. Lots of headlines about the decline of the humanities and people chasing after STEM careers and instant riches and this kind of stuff. That's true. I mean, all of that is, I don't want to exaggerate it, but there have been some interesting trend lines about the gravitation of today's younger students towards STEM, and that's been going on for more than 10 years, actually. So this is real stuff. And I think that but I also want to highlight some commonalities, and I've been in conversation with some folks after actually one outcome of the 2017 original portrait project was that it got noticed by people in the tech world, people in the medical world, who said, you know what, we're having the exact same problem. All of our people end up as middle managers. All of our people end up with a ceiling of some sort on their careers. And we don't know why it is that, Asian Americans cannot seem to penetrate to the highest levels. I spoke with the medical school people. In the medical school people, the first Asian American to become dean of a medical school was something like in the 2012, or it was in Utah, I think it was. That's in medical school, where you would think there is no shortage of Asian Americans who have become doctors, who have become faculty at prestigious institutions. And the idea that none of them rose to the highest level of leadership in a medical school until the present day, basically, is just a stunning fact to consider. And you hear this also in the tech industry. And so, I've taken to accepting speaking engagements from these places. It's sort of like invading, the other side. I had signed up and then for whatever reason didn't work out at a conference of surgeons once. And I still hope to speak to that group because I'm going to tell all of them to counsel their kids to become lawyers instead of surgeons. But, but I think there is a kind of touch point that can be had within our community about the general flow of Asian Americans into leadership positions. And, probably some of that will spill over into a motivation to explore why that is. And those who are inclined to kind of, think about these kinds of issues might be persuadable to enter law. But again, I think so much of this is changing societal expectations of what people can become. And that goes, I don't mean, just kind of mainstream, culture, although that is an important thing. I'm talking also about the specific communities in which, all of us inhabit and, our familial relationships, our memberships and the specific communities and conversations that people have. I think, again, the fact that there's 55,000, 60,000 Asian American lawyers today is a tremendous asset to be brought to bear on that conversation.
Our conversation here has been really focused on law school enrollment, obviously what the study focuses on. But, to that point, in terms of Asian Americans and leadership, I wonder if you have any insights as to leadership programs or initiatives to help sort of those that have reached that middle tier go on to the next tier, and certainly, Justice Liu, your accomplishments serve as a role model for many attorneys, and I wonder if you have some advice for those who are either earlier in their career or mid-career, what they can do to sort of lift themselves up to become leaders.
Yes. So there are a lot of things going on. So I want to make space and room for people like, Phil, Miranda, and others who are in the law firms where there's a lot of focus on this kind of stuff today. I'm very curious whether people in the law firms feel like there's more than lip service being paid to mentoring and sponsoring individuals to kind of move people along. But that's, organizationally, I think it begins with kind of people's immediate environments in terms of workplace and getting the appropriate supports there. Outside of that, there are a number of interesting projects. I've talked to Don Liu at Xerox quite a bit about LCLD, which is a leadership program for minority council of all minorities and women, I think, as well, which is a very intensive leadership and mentoring program to help people reach the partnership ranks and higher levels in corporate counsel offices. I think that NAPABA has a role to play. I think at every convention, there's a variety of wonderful mentoring and leadership development opportunities that then become ongoing throughout the year. I think that the sweet spot of that is definitely, those mid-career associates who are, trying to think about what is going to be their next move. Are they going to exit their firms? Are they going to go in-house? Are they going to leave law altogether? Are they going to go into government? Figuring out what is a realistic path ahead for people is really kind of where you got to grab people and bring them along. It should be said that the information we've seen from the ABF shows that Asian Americans have the highest attrition rates of all the groups at the big law firms, and also shows that probably some significant part of the explanation of that is that they go in-house at higher rates than virtually every other group. And so it's not necessarily a bad thing that people leave law firms to go in-house, although it does mean that there becomes a vacuum at the top of law firms with respect to Asian Americans. I mean, those of you who are at the top of your law firms, I'm sure, can certainly attest to this. But we have to figure out on both paths in the corporate counsel offices as well as in the firms how people can move up the ranks. And I think for better or for worse, I think much of the answer actually lies within our own community. It's going to be a bit of self-help. Organizational structures will evolve and hopefully add to these efforts a bit. But I'm afraid to say that a large part of it is going to depend on our willingness actually to mentor each other and to bring each other along. I will say this is an unflattering comment, but we heard numerous times in the numerous focus groups that we did in the first Portrait Project research. We did 12 focus groups in the New Orleans NAPABA conference in 2016. Many people said that Asian Americans don't help each other enough, that there is not the ladder that's extended once people have risen up, and there isn't the same kind of ethos of self-help within our community as they've observed in other communities. And so this is something for us to have some candid conversations about.
I'd also say, so we undertook some literature review, and with respect to law firms particularly, there's a pretty good paper by Devin Carvato and Mitu Gulati, which specifically analyzes how a law firm, just the structure of a law firm, makes it slightly difficult for advancement. And that is to say, in this paper, they basically say, listen, elite law firms have basically what are two tracks, right? One track is for people who want to be partner, and the characteristics that you would select for someone on that track would be things like charisma, leadership ability, ability to sell, have a book of business, that sort of thing. But then given the upper out structure, there's another track, which is equally as important, which is just to have a staff for people who will be at the law firm anywhere from 2 to 6 years, but not longer. And the characteristics that they would select for those are things like very hardworking, not necessarily obedient, but, very willing to sort of be a good soldier and do what needs to be done. And so the question becomes, if the problem really is, how do you translate from Asians who are usually stereotyped to be in the latter track, how do you get them to switch on to the first track? You really have to think about sort of how those characteristics might, pose obstacles. And so in addition to the focus groups that we conducted at APABA, we also interviewed partners at various law firms who had sort of successfully bridged that gap. And a lot of them have mentioned, their identity as an Asian and how that has impacted them. And a lot of them have mentioned the importance of sort of overcoming stereotype, or, finding ways to subvert those expectations, or even referencing Kenji Yoshino's theory on covering, and how, deployed in certain ways to a certain extent, that might actually be very helpful. So there's sort of a lot of smaller tactics. I can't speak to sort of larger problems, especially having just joined a law firm, or larger programs, but certainly there's sort of individual things that you can do to sort of buck those stereotypes.
Just like I sort of mentioned earlier as well, the idea of mentorship is really important, and what Justice Liu talked about in terms of self-help. If that's lacking, it can be very difficult necessarily to find a mentor who's like you, who you have commonalities with, who share common hobbies with, things like that. At my own firm, I think a lot of the leadership has been cognizant of that. I think there have been a lot more Asian partners now than there were, a few decades ago, and I think the ones who are there, in my experience, have been very supportive and have been trying to reach out, but it's been like a continuing conversation, I guess. And I think in this current climate, I think it's been even more of a conversation. I think we've actually started, a group just for Asian attorneys to connect. That includes partners and associates at my firm, and it's been a very positive development. But it's sort of arisen out of recent events. We have affinity groups now, instead of just the a global diversity group or multicultural group, as we called it in the past. So I think that's been very positive, and hopefully, leads to more mentorship opportunities. The focus groups we ran essentially said that a lot of the people on those focus groups said that they didn't feel like they had mentors, and also they were getting some hints that they might not necessarily be favored to continue at the firm. A lot of it was like unspoken in some ways, and maybe it was them extrapolating, but we heard those themes sort of repeatedly.
So, this is probably going to be my last question here. As a follow-on to that, as a new associate at your firm, what tactics have you deployed to sort of identify some mentors? I think, having worked in career and professional development for attorneys, there are a lot of formal programs and you can match people, but the best mentors and best career advocates often happen organically. They're not someone that's sort of ticked off a list that you have lunch with once a month. And so, especially given that you have this research, I wonder, if you've had conversations, or if there are tactics you've deployed in your time, in your most recent time at your firm, to help identify some role models and leaders for the success of your own career. Putting you on the spot a little bit.
I'm happy to talk about that. I mean, I'm very new at my firm. I'm a first-year associate, but so far I have felt that, as I mentioned earlier, the APA partners have been very willing to reach out. Other than that, I pretty much take on most projects that are interesting that come across to me, and just try to do as good of a job as I can. But I am keeping an eye toward, the APA partners, and just thinking about how, I could get on projects with them as well and try to develop those relationships, because I think they will have gone through a lot of the similar challenges that I may face in the future.
One thing that we've heard from a lot of people we've interviewed is that while it's, you know, really important to sort of see yourself reflected and to find people who have, you know, understanding of sort of your circumstances, and it may feel more comfortable to go to people who are similarly situated, frequently some of the best mentors have been what people will say, oh, white men or people in power who have nothing in common with me. And that's because the difference of perspective actually becomes really helpful when you're sort of assessing a situation. But with that said, personally, I think I do sort of very similar things to Phil. I think at the end of the day, the best mentorship relationships are really, they are organic. And so it really just comes from starting to have an assignment with them or having some kind of interaction with them. And then from that experience, thinking, do I feel comfortable? And does this person seem like they would be a willing mentor and a good mentor? And if so, then sort of then sliding in a, hey, would you mind if we got coffee to ask about such and such, or sending an email asking a question that may be slightly work related, slightly give me your advice, and sort of going from shades from there. But I don't have other particular wisdom.
And I think that's great advice. I mean, I think that's great advice because that's how that organic relationship develops, really, right? Well, we are at our time. I want to thank all three of you for your time today and for sharing the study and for the conversation. And I want to again thank NAPABA and APABA-DC for hosting us today. And hopefully we can continue this conversation. I believe NAPABA is having a series of conversations regarding this study and this topic, and so there will be more to come. So thank you very much for your time and your participation today.
Thank you, Ethel.
Thanks for moderating.